This is how to write a lab write-up for Mrs. Manuel science class. This video was made in 2016, so there might be some things to adjust in the future. There are 7 basic points to a lab write-up, and we're going to go through all 7 of these steps in the video, so feel free to jump ahead after you've already got them down. We're going to start with number 1, title. The title is most likely going to be given in class with something as simple as the number of the experiment. If we're in Module 4, possibly the experiment 4.1. Now that can be simple and yet vague, and we won't remember exactly what that lab is about. So if you also add maybe the content of the lab itself, experiment 4.1 magnetism, it's easier for you to remember what it is, as well as including it when you message me with questions. I'll know what it is. Usually done in class, but there's some freedom on what you do with that one. Purpose and question. Now some of the labs we do in class will be more purpose-driven, as in we're just seeing what happens, we're learning about a concept, or we're learning about an idea. There's other times where it'll be question-driven. Which fertilizer will affect the growth of flowers the most? And then that will most likely also be given in class. Although when you come up with your own experiments for something like an evening of the arts or for a science fair, you're coming up with a question because it's something that you're going to test. Next comes hypothesis. So this year I'm implementing a very specific way in responding to a question or a purpose, which was just mentioned in our hypothesis. It must be written in an if, then, because format. So given our previous question of which fertilizer will affect the growth of flowers the most, it would be written if fertilizer does affect the growth of flowers, then I think Miracle-Gro would have the best effect because, and this is when you would insert something of your own knowledge of it or an experience you've had to prove why it's a hypothesis and not a guess. So if fertilizer does affect the growth of flowers, then Miracle-Gro would have the greatest effect on their growth because when I used it on my tomatoes, the tomatoes I used it on ripened sooner and grew larger. If, then, because, and it's using that question in the hypothesis. Okay, next comes materials. Now, materials is simply all of the things you use in the lab to do the experiment, down specifically to the ruler you're using or any sort of measurement you need, as well as the things you need for the experiment itself. Most of that's also either in your book on the experiment we're using, will be given in class because you actually used it, but when writing your own experiment, materials, primarily the thing that is forgotten is whatever is used to get the results. The measurement stick, the timer, a calendar to note days, things like that. That brings us to the bulk of a write-up, which is procedure. Now I recommend doing procedures in a numerical 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, just like you would a recipe, but the more steps that are attributed to a number, it's easier to say repeat steps 2 through 4. Repeat steps 2 through 6 with this new change, using that manipulated variable, the thing that you're measuring. So in our first question about the fertilizer, step 1, plant 5 identical plants. Step 2, add 10 drops of fertilizer every 7 days. Step 3, measure the plant every week after adding fertilizer. Step 4, repeat steps 2 through 3 for the next fertilizer. You see how it saves time. So if they are in numerical order, telling you the steps, always using it at least 3 trials because we don't want to have some outlier that makes up a new, gives us data that doesn't actually represent the truth of what's happening. And repeating it 3 times, making sure there's things in place that all of our measurements are true and valid. That's procedure. This will be gone over in class in greater detail, and I'll probably make another video just for procedure. All right. Results. Now, there's two main parts to results. One is just the raw data, the raw observation that's found. The second is synthesizing that data, synthesizing those observations in either a graph or a pie chart or a pictorial format. But this is just data. This isn't explaining anything. This is just the numbers or observations that are had. And then in a synthesized way, meaning on average, the amount of growth per fertilizer was 3 inches a week. That's it. Okay, last step. Conclusion. 4 main parts to a conclusion. The first one is either restating the purpose or question in your hypothesis, telling us whether or not you were correct, or actually word for word putting it into the question there, into the conclusion, saying my hypothesis was correct, my hypothesis was incorrect. The second part, which is frequently overlooked, is using the data from results in your conclusion, the synthesized data. So if your hypothesis was correct, use data that proved your hypothesis was correct in your conclusion. If your hypothesis was incorrect, show the data that showed your hypothesis was incorrect. The last part of conclusion, which is by far the most important, is your explanation. Why? Why did that data show you what it did? Why did you get the results that you did? Now, this isn't something you're going to have to know from your head. It's something you're going to find from your reading. You're going to have to look up and get greater information online. But your explanation is the part that says, hey, I learned something from this entire experiment. I actually learned something, and here's what I learned. Now, sometimes what you learned isn't going to be supported in your data. And that's where we get to the fourth step of conclusion, which is if there are any errors or your experiment was incomplete. So errors, mistakes that you made, you measured it incorrectly, one of the plants was too close to the window and it got cooked, so the fertilizer didn't actually, you didn't get to see the results of the fertilizer, you got to see that it got too much sun and it died. So you didn't get to see the true results of the Miracle Grow. Even though it could have very well been the best one, it died before the fertilizer had a chance to grow. The second part of the end of this, so the errors that happen, the second is, if I were to do this experiment again, or if I were going to take this to the next level, what would it be? A variety of plants. It could be adding trees to the mix, or growing grass as well as petunias, or fruits and vegetables. Changing the amount of time that you do it. So maybe instead of just doing it for a month, you did it for 6 months to see the longevity of the effects of fertilizer. So all in all, we've got all 7 steps. They each have specific things. If you have questions, always ask.